I've worked as a nurse for nearly 10 years now, and most of the time, it's pretty uneventful. Don't get me wrong, there are the usual stresses, long hours, difficult patients, and the occasional gut-wrenching case. But what happened during one of my night shifts at an old hospital downtown? That still haunts me to this day. I've never told anyone this story before, but I need to get it off my chest. Maybe if I tell it, it will stop creeping into my dreams. The hospital I worked at wasn't your average modern building. It was old, really old, built back in the 1930s. It had been renovated a few times, but no amount of fresh paint or new equipment could mask its eerie, outdated structure. The creaky floors, dim lighting, and long, echoing hallways made it feel like it was stuck between two worlds, the living and something else. This particular night was quiet, almost too quiet. I was working the night shift, and as usual, I expected the ER to be filled with its usual chaos, accidents, drunks, the usual. But for some reason, it was dead. The silence was unnerving. There were no beeping monitors, no rushing doctors or panicking families. Even the usual hum of the ventilation system seemed unusually soft. Around 2 a.m., just when I was starting to get a little drowsy, the lights flickered. I chalked it up to the old building's faulty wiring and kept working on my charts. But then I heard something. It was faint at first, but definitely there. A sort of muffled cry, like someone was in pain. I looked up from my desk, but there was no one around. I stood up, walked out into the hallway, and listened carefully. The sound came again, a soft, agonizing moan. My heart began to race, but I told myself it was probably just a patient in one of the nearby rooms. I checked room 211, where an elderly woman had been admitted earlier that night. She was sleeping soundly. The next room, 212, was empty, as were the ones after it. But the moaning continued, louder now, like it was coming from somewhere deeper in the hospital. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing down the deserted hallway. The further I walked, the colder it got. This hospital was old, but this cold felt unnatural, like the air itself was pressing against my skin. I was walking toward the east wing, a section of the hospital that had been closed off for renovations. No one was supposed to be in there. The moaning stopped abruptly as I reached the double doors leading to the east wing. For a moment, I considered turning back, but my curiosity, or maybe something else, pushed me forward. I opened the doors, the hinges creaking loudly in the quiet night. The east wing was even darker and colder. Dust coated everything, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. I shined my flashlight down the corridor, illuminating the abandoned rooms on either side. Then I heard it again, the moan. But this time, it was followed by something else, a whisper. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sounded close, almost like it was right next to my ear. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I continued down the hall, my footsteps crunching on the dust-covered floor. The moaning grew louder, more pained, like someone was suffering in one of the nearby rooms. I reached the end of the hallway, where the last room stood. Room 237. I stared at the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. Suddenly, the door swung open on its own. Inside, the room was pitch black, except for a faint light coming from a small, old-fashioned lamp in the corner. In the center of the room was a hospital bed. The sheets were pulled up over the body of someone lying there, unmoving. I hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room. My flashlight flickered as I approached the bed. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, like I was wading through water. I pulled back the sheet, revealing a man lying on the bed, his face pale and sunken. His eyes were closed, and his skin looked wrong, like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. I checked for a pulse, but as I expected, there was none. The man was clearly dead, but there was something off about his body. It didn't look like it had been there for days. It looked ancient, decayed far beyond what was normal. I turned to leave, my mind racing with questions. But just as I reached the door, I heard it, a raspy, broken voice. "Help me." I froze. The voice came from the bed. I slowly turned around, and to my horror, the dead man's eyes were open. They were milky white, staring directly at me. His mouth moved slowly, repeating the same words. "Help, Mum." I backed away, my body trembling with fear. The man's head slowly turned to follow me, his bony fingers twitching under the sheet. "Please help me." I ran. I didn't look back. I bolted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. I could hear the man's voice behind me, growing fainter as I ran, but still there, still pleading. I didn't stop until I reached the main part of the hospital. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, my heart racing in my chest. I told myself it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But deep down, I knew what I saw. The rest of my shift passed in a blur. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Who would believe me? The next morning, I went back to the East Wing, determined to find some logical explanation, but when I reached room 237, it was empty. No bed, no body, nothing. I quit my job at that hospital shortly after that night. I couldn't stand being there, couldn't stand the thought of walking those halls again. But even now, years later, I still hear his voice sometimes, in the quiet moments when I'm alone. Help me. It never leaves me. Hospitals always gave me the creeps, but I never let it bother me too much. Working as a janitor at a small community hospital, you get used to the smell of antiseptic, the dim flickering lights, and the occasional weird noise echoing down the hall. It's part of the job, right? At least that's what I used to think. But something happened one night that still haunts me, something I can't explain. I worked a night shift, less traffic, fewer people, just me and the quiet hum of machines. My job was simple: clean the floors, empty the trash, and make sure the place didn't look like a mess. The hospital had 3 floors that were usually active, but there was a 4th floor that had been closed off for years. It was common knowledge among the staff that the 4th floor was where they used to keep psychiatric patients back in the day. Eventually, they shut it down after a fire gutted part of the wing. No one ever went up there, at least no one was supposed to. It was around 2:30 a.m. when the elevator dinged open for no reason on the 3rd floor where I was mopping. I glanced over, expecting to see someone step out, but the elevator was empty. I brushed it off as a mechanical glitch and kept working. But then I noticed something strange. The button for the 4th floor was lit up. My stomach did a little flip. The elevator hadn't been to the 4th floor in years, not since the fire. Out of curiosity, I walked over and stepped inside, feeling a cold draft as the doors closed behind me. I don't know what made me press the button, but before I knew it, I was heading up to the forbidden floor. As the elevator rose, the lights inside flickered, casting weird shadows on the walls. My nerves were already on edge, but when the doors opened, I almost turned back. The air on the 4th floor felt stale, like it hadn't been touched in decades. A thick layer of dust coated everything. The hallway stretched out in front of me, lined with empty patient rooms, their doors hanging slightly ajar. It was dead silent. No buzzing lights, no distant voices, just complete suffocating quiet. I told myself I'd just look around for a second, satisfy my curiosity, and then get the hell out of there. But as I stepped out of the elevator, I noticed something odd. There was a faint light coming from one of the rooms at the end of the hall. I stood there, frozen for a moment. No one had been on this floor for years, so why was there a light on? My legs moved on their own as I slowly made my way down the hall, my footsteps muffled by the dust-covered floor. As I got closer, I realized the door wasn't fully closed. A soft flickering glow seeped through the crack. I reached out, hesitated for a second, then pushed the door open. Inside the room was a single hospital bed, and sitting on the bed was a woman. Her back was to me, her long black hair falling over the hospital gown she wore. The light was coming from a small lamp on a bedside table, flickering like it was about to burn out. For a second, I didn't move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There shouldn't be anyone up here. I didn't know whether to approach her or run, but something about the way she was sitting, the stiffness of her posture, made my skin crawl. "Ma'am," I said, my voice trembling a bit. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond, didn't move, just sat there staring straight ahead at the wall. I took a step closer. "Do you need help?" Still nothing, but then, without turning around, she whispered something. I could barely hear it, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Don't leave me." Her voice was soft, broken, like she hadn't spoken in years. I felt my heart race and every instinct screamed at me to get out of there, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, watching her, waiting for her to do something, anything, and then she did. Slowly, painfully, she turned her head to the side, just enough for me to see her face. Her skin was pale, almost gray, her eyes hollow and sunken. But what terrified me the most was her expression. Her lips were twisted into the faintest smile, but her eyes were filled with anguish, as if she were caught between two emotions, joy and despair. "Please, don't leave me," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't wait for her to say anything else. I turned and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I ran down the hallway, not daring to look back, and threw myself into the elevator. As the doors closed, I heard a soft scraping sound from the hall, like something was being dragged across the floor. The elevator descended, and when the doors opened again, I practically sprinted out, my legs trembling beneath me. I didn't stop until I was back on the ground floor, standing under the bright fluorescent lights of the lobby, gasping for breath. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, maybe my mind playing tricks on me because I was tired. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. The hospital's history had always been shrouded in mystery, especially the 4th floor. There were rumors among the staff, whispers of patients who never left, of people who had gone mad in that wing. I never went back to the 4th floor after that night. I tried to forget about it, to put it behind me. But sometimes when I'm alone in the hospital at night, I think I hear her voice again. Faint, almost like a breeze whispering down the hall. "Don't leave me," and I never can. I never believed in ghosts. As a rational person with a background in biology, I dismissed tales of hauntings and supernatural occurrences as mere figments of overactive imaginations. That was until I spent a night working the late shift at St. Mary's Hospital, specifically in Ward 13, a place shrouded in unsettling rumors and dark history. St. Mary's was an old hospital, established in the early 1900s. Over the decades, it had expanded and modernized, but certain sections remained untouched, preserving the eerie atmosphere of bygone eras. Ward 13 was one such section. Officially, it was the psychiatric ward, but whispers among the staff suggested something far more sinister lurked within its walls. I was a night shift nurse, responsible for checking vitals, administering medications, and ensuring the overall well-being of patients. On most nights, it was monotonous and uneventful. However, Ward 13 was different. It was rarely occupied, and when it was, patients were transferred from other facilities for reasons too grim to discuss openly. That particular night began like any other. The hospital was quiet, the only sounds being the hum of machines and the distant murmur of other nurses moving through the halls. I started my rounds, checking each room methodically. When I reached Ward 13, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, a rare occurrence. Normally, the door was firmly closed, secured with a lock that required a keycard to open. Curiosity piqued, I approached the door cautiously. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long shadows that danced eerily along the walls. I pushed the door open further and stepped inside, calling out softly, "Hello? Is anyone here?" There was no response, only the faint sound of my own footsteps echoing off the linoleum floor. The room was sparsely furnished, with a few beds lining the walls, each equipped with restraints and outdated medical equipment. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and something else I couldn't quite identify, something metallic and slightly sweet. I walked down the corridor, checking each room as I went. Most were empty, but one room caught my attention. The door was closed, but I could see a faint light emanating from within. I approached and placed my ear against the door, straining to hear any sounds. To my surprise, I heard soft whispers, indistinct, but undeniably present. My rational mind tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was another nurse on a nearby shift or a patient murmuring in their sleep. But Ward 13 was supposed to be empty at this hour. I hesitated for a moment before knocking gently on the door. "Is someone in there?" The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. My heart began to race, and a chill ran down my spine. I slowly turned the knob and pushed the door open, revealing an empty room bathed in the dim glow of a single lamp on a bedside table. Nothing seemed out of place, no signs of a struggle, no movement. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and turned to leave. But as I did, something caught my eye. On the far wall, partially obscured by shadows, was a figure sitting in a wheelchair. It was barely visible, but the faint outline suggested a person was present. I froze, my rational thoughts battling with the rising fear in my chest. "Hello?" I called out again, louder this time. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move slowly towards me, each movement deliberate and unnaturally stiff. I took a step back, my mind screaming to run, but my body remained rooted to the spot. As the figure approached, the whispers returned, clearer this time, though still unintelligible. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, my breath shallow and rapid. The figure stopped a few feet away from me, and I could now see it clearly. A woman in a tattered hospital gown, her eyes hollow and empty, her skin pale as if drained of life. "Who are you?" I managed to stammer, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she lifted her hand, pointing towards the corner of the room. My eyes followed her gesture, landing on an old, dusty mirror propped against the wall. The mirror was large, its glass cracked and smeared, reflecting a distorted image of the room. I approached the mirror cautiously, trying to see if there was anything unusual. As I drew closer, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further, my breath visible in the cold air. My reflection stared back at me, but something was off. Behind my image, in the mirror's reflection, I could see another figure standing just out of sight, a shadowy presence that didn't exist in the actual room. A chill ran down my spine as the whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices overlapping in a disorienting symphony. I turned to look back at the woman, but she was gone, leaving me alone with the unsettling reflection in the mirror. Determined to make sense of what was happening, I reached out to touch the mirror's surface. My fingers met the cold glass, and for a split second, I felt a sharp pain shoot through my hand, as if invisible claws had grabbed me. I pulled back quickly, my heart racing even faster. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a violent force, plunging the room into darkness. The only light now came from the mirror, which seemed to glow ominously. The whispers intensified, surrounding me from all sides, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. Panicking, I tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my cries were swallowed by the oppressive silence. Desperation set in as I realized I was trapped, the malevolent presence in the room growing stronger with each passing second. I glanced back at the mirror, hoping for a distraction, but instead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My reflection was no longer mimicking my movements. It stood still, its eyes meeting mine with a sinister intent. Slowly, it raised a hand and pressed a finger to its lips, signaling me to be quiet. I swallowed hard, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. The whispers seemed to respond, the voices growing more urgent, more pleading. I couldn't understand the words, but the emotion behind them was clear: desperation and fear. Gathering what little courage I had left, I decided to confront whatever was happening. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The reflection in the mirror smiled, a twisted, knowing smile that sent shivers down my spine. It raised a hand again, pointing not to the mirror, but to the floor beneath me. My gaze followed, and I saw faint, ghostly figures swirling just above the ground. Trapped souls, their faces contorted in agony, their bodies tethered to the physical world by invisible chains. Realization dawned on me. Ward 13 wasn't just a psychiatric ward. It had been a place of torment, where patients were subjected to inhumane treatments, their minds and bodies broken. The fire that had gutted part of the wing years ago was no accident. It was a cover-up for the atrocities committed within these walls. And now, their restless spirits were trapped here, forever reliving their suffering. The reflection in the mirror reached out towards me, its hand passing through the glass with ease. "Help us," I heard the collective voices plead, the whispers forming a haunting chorus that resonated within my very soul. I backed away from the mirror, my mind racing for a solution. There had to be a way to release these tortured spirits, to put an end to their suffering. I remembered reading about rituals and practices that could help restless souls find peace, but I had no idea where to begin. Desperation gave way to determination. I couldn't leave them like this, trapped and in pain. I needed to find out more about the history of Ward 13, to understand what had happened here and how to stop it. But I was trapped, unable to leave the room until I figured it out. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I want to help you," I whispered, more to myself than to the spirits. "Tell me what I need to do." The whispers seemed to respond, growing softer but more coherent. Images flashed in my mind. Scenes of the past, of patients being restrained, of cruel experiments, of flames engulfing the ward as panic set in. The mirror began to shimmer, showing glimpses of the tragic events that had unfolded here. I focused on the mirror, trying to piece together the fragments of memories it was showing me. The patients had been subjected to electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and other brutal treatments. The fire had been set deliberately, intended to destroy evidence and silence any who might expose the horrors within Ward 13. But how could I help them now? Their spirits were bound to this place by the trauma and pain they had endured. Perhaps acknowledging their suffering and giving them a sense of closure was the key. I spoke again, louder this time, my voice filled with empathy. "I'm sorry for what you went through. I want to help you find peace." The mirror's surface began to ripple, as if responding to my words. The ghostly figures around me seemed to calm, their anguished expressions softening. The whispers became a harmonious hum, a gentle lullaby that filled the room with a sense of hope. A light began to emanate from the mirror, growing brighter and warmer. The reflection of the woman in the wheelchair faded, replaced by a serene image of a peaceful garden, a stark contrast to the darkness of Ward 13. The ghostly figures started to fade, their forms dissolving into the light as they moved towards the garden scene, finally finding the peace they had been seeking for so long. The door to the room swung open quietly, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. I stepped out into the hallway, the cold air replaced by a comforting warmth. The whispers had ceased, replaced by the gentle sounds of a new dawn. As I made my way back to the main areas of the hospital, I felt a sense of accomplishment and relief. I had done what I could to help the restless spirits of Ward 13 find peace, but as I reached the end of my shift and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within me. In the weeks that followed, Ward 13 remained quiet, no longer haunted by the whispers of tortured souls. The staff noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a lingering sense of calm that seemed to permeate the once troubled ward. Patients reported feeling less anxious, more at ease, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. But every now and then, late at night, when the hospital was at its quietest, I could still hear faint whispers, a reminder of the night I helped the spirits of Ward 13 find their way to peace. And while I no longer feared the supernatural, I never forgot the lessons learned in that haunted ward. One evening, several months after that fateful night, I received a letter in the mail. It was an old yellowed piece of paper with elegant handwriting, signed by the original head nurse of Ward 13, long since deceased. The letter detailed the tragic history of the ward, confirming the stories I had heard and providing a heartfelt thanks for setting the spirits free. As I read the letter, a sense of closure washed over me. I realized that some places hold on to pain and suffering until someone is brave enough to confront it. St. Mary's Hospital would always carry the shadows of its past, but thanks to that one night, Ward 13 could finally move forward, leaving behind the whispers of anguish and embracing a future free from the horrors that once plagued its halls. From that night on, I embraced a newfound respect for the unseen and the stories that linger in forgotten places. St. Mary's continued to function as a beacon of healing, its walls no longer echoing with the cries of the tormented, but filled with the promise of hope and renewal. And though I never encountered anything as terrifying as Ward 13 again, I carried with me the memory of that night, a testament to the power of compassion and the importance of listening to the voices that desperately seek to be heard. As years passed, St. Mary's underwent further renovations, modernizing even the old sections that had once been so foreboding. Ward 13 was officially closed and repurposed, its dark history carefully documented and preserved. The stories of the restless spirits became part of the hospital's lore, a cautionary tale about the importance of humane treatment and the lingering echoes of the past. I often thought back to that night, reflecting on how a single act of kindness and understanding could alter the course of so many lives, even those that had long since departed. The experience taught me that sometimes the scariest things aren't the apparitions or the unexplained noises, but the unresolved pain and the need for closure that resides within each soul. One particularly quiet evening, as I walked through the now renovated Ward 13, I felt a gentle breeze brush against my skin. It was a subtle reminder that the spirits had indeed found peace, their presence no longer a source of fear, but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The room was now bright and welcoming, with fresh paint and modern furnishings, a stark contrast to the darkness that once dominated it. I paused for a moment, taking in the transformation, and felt a sense of gratitude for the night that had changed everything. St. Mary's had become more than just a hospital. It was a place where lives were saved, where hope was restored, and where even the darkest corners could find light with a little compassion. As I left the hospital that night, the cool air felt refreshing, and the moon cast a serene glow over the building. I couldn't help but smile, knowing that Ward 13 was no longer a place of horror, but a symbol of healing and redemption. The whispers had been silenced, replaced by the harmonious sounds of a hospital dedicated to saving lives and nurturing hope. In the end, it wasn't the supernatural elements that defined my experience at St. Mary's, but the profound impact of understanding, empathy, and the unwavering belief that even the most tormented souls deserve peace. And though I still shuddered at the memory of those haunted whispers, I found solace in knowing that I had played a part in turning their sorrow into serenity. Life went on, and so did my career at St. Mary's, each night shift a little less daunting than the last. The legends of Ward 13 became stories I shared with new staff, not to frighten them, but to remind them of the importance of kindness and the enduring power of the human spirit. And every so often, when the night was particularly still, I'd catch a faint whisper carried on the breeze, a lingering thank you from the spirits who had finally found their peace. Hospitals are strange places, especially at night. There's something about the sterile white walls, the lingering scent of disinfectant, and the echoing quiet that just feels wrong. I've been working as a night nurse for about 6 years, and in that time, I've seen my fair share of strange things. But nothing prepared me for what happened in room 502. The hospital I work at is one of those older buildings that's been around forever. It's not uncommon for people to talk about how haunted it is, especially on the higher floors. I never really believed in that stuff. Most of the time, it's just bored coworkers or stressed out patients telling stories to pass the time. But room 502? That's a different story entirely. I'd heard the rumors. Every hospital has that room, the one no one wants to work in. At our hospital, that room was 502. People whispered that something bad had happened there a long time ago, something dark, but the details were always vague. Some claimed it was a botched surgery, others said it was a suicide. No one knew for sure, but the room had a reputation. Patients who stayed in there often complained about strange noises, cold spots, and an overwhelming sense of dread. But nothing ever happened when I was around, until that night. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, and I was halfway through my shift. The hospital was unusually empty, with only a handful of patients scattered across the floors. Around 2 a.m., I was going through my rounds when I got a call from the front desk. "We have a new patient for you, heading up to room 502, the receptionist said. I felt a chill run down my spine. Room 502 had been empty for weeks, and no one ever requested it unless they had no other choice. I didn't say anything, just nodded and prepared the room, trying to ignore the growing unease in my gut. The patient, Mr. Harris, was brought up a few minutes later. He was in his late 50s, a man with thinning hair and sunken eyes. The chart said he was here for observation after a minor heart attack. Routine, easy, nothing out of the ordinary. As I wheeled him into 502, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, though I couldn't quite place it. The room itself looked normal, just another bland hospital room with the same dull beige walls, a single bed, and a small window overlooking the parking lot. But as soon as we crossed the threshold, Mr. Harris flinched, like he felt something I couldn't see. "Cold in here," he muttered, rubbing his arms. "It's just the air conditioning," I assured him, though I didn't really believe it myself. I set him up in the bed, made sure he was comfortable, and left to finish my rounds. For the next hour, everything was fine. The hospital was dead quiet, the kind of stillness that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. Around 3:15 a.m., I decided to check in on Mr. Harris. As I walked down the hall toward room 502, I heard a noise, a soft rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on wood. It was coming from his room. I hesitated outside the door, listening. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow, deliberate, almost like a heartbeat. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door before entering. Mr. Harris was awake, sitting upright in bed, staring at the far corner of the room. His face was pale, and his hands gripped the sheets so tightly his knuckles were white. "Mr. Harris?" I asked, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" He didn't respond. He just kept staring at the corner, unblinking. I followed his gaze but saw nothing, just an empty chair. "Mr. Harris," I said again, a little louder this time. Slowly he turned his head to look at me, his eyes wide with fear. "There's someone in the room," he whispered, his voice shaky. I glanced around, but we were the only ones there. "No one's here but us." He shook his head violently. "No, you don't understand. It's watching me. It's been here since you left." A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I walked over to the chair and inspected it, but there was nothing unusual. Still, the atmosphere in the room felt thick, like the air was heavy with something unseen. I tried to keep my voice calm. "It's probably just your mind playing tricks on you," I said. "You've had a long day. Why don't you try to get some sleep?" Mr. Harris didn't look convinced, but he nodded reluctantly. I gave him a final glance before leaving the room, shutting the door behind me. As I walked down the hall, the tapping sound started again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was louder, more insistent. I stopped in my tracks, turning to look back at the closed door of room 502. My heart was pounding in my chest. I wasn't superstitious, but something was off about that room. I debated whether to go back inside, but before I could make up my mind, I heard a crash from inside the room. Without thinking, I rushed back, threw open the door, and ran inside. Mr. Harris was out of bed, standing in the middle of the room, breathing heavily. The lamp on the bedside table had been knocked over, and the chair was lying on its side. "What happened?" I asked, rushing to his side. They tried to take me," he gasped, his voice trembling. "They tried to drag me into the corner." My blood ran cold. Who tried to take you?" Pointed to the corner of the room, his hand shaking violently. "The shadows. They came out of the walls. I saw them. They were pulling at me, trying to take me. I couldn't stop them." I glanced at the corner, but again, there was nothing. Just an empty wall, dimly lit by the overhead light. Still, the look in his eyes, pure, unfiltered terror, was enough to convince me that something had happened. I helped him back into bed and checked his vitals. His heart rate was elevated, but nothing too alarming. "I'm going to stay here for a little while, okay?" I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He nodded, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting something to leap out at him. I sat down in the chair, keeping an eye on him. For a while, everything was quiet. But then, just as I was starting to think it had all been in his head, the temperature in the room dropped. I could feel it immediately. The air around us grew icy, our breaths visible in the cold. I stood up, rubbing my arms to ward off the chill. The lights overhead flickered, and a deep, unsettling hum filled the room. Suddenly, Mr. Harris began to scream. It wasn't a normal scream. It was primal, filled with sheer terror. He thrashed in the bed, his eyes wide as he stared at the corner where the shadows had apparently tried to take him. "They're back," he screamed. "They're back." I tried to calm him, but something was wrong. The air felt heavier, oppressive, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move, twisting and writhing like living things. "Help me," Mr. Harris shouted, his voice cracking. "Please, don't let them take me." I ran to the bed, trying to hold him down as he struggled, but it was like he was fighting against something invisible. His arms flailed wildly, and he clawed at the air as though trying to push something away. Then, in an instant, it stopped. Mr. Harris went limp, collapsing onto the bed, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. The room was quiet again, but the sense of dread lingered. I stood there, panting, unsure of what had just happened. And then, slowly, Mr. Harris turned his head to me, his eyes wide and glassy. He opened his mouth to speak, but instead of words, a cold, rattling breath escaped his lips. "They're here." His body convulsed, and before I could react, he went completely still. The monitors beeped frantically, and I rushed to check his pulse, but it was too late. His eyes were still open, staring blankly at the ceiling, his face frozen in terror. I called for help, and the doctors rushed in, but it was no use. Mr. Harris was dead. They ruled it a heart attack, a sudden and unexpected failure. But I know what I saw. I know what he saw. Something was in that room with us, something dark and twisted, hiding in the shadows. I've requested never to work near room 502 again. Some things in that hospital don't belong in this world. Working the night shift in the ER was never easy. There was always a rush of chaotic energy, the kind that kept you awake even after your shift ended. But in the quieter hours, between 2 and 4 a.m., things would often slow down. That's when the hospital felt different, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows in the deserted hallways, the constant hum of machines the only sound. That was when I'd see things. I'm not someone who believes in ghosts, or at least I wasn't. But something about the hospital, especially the emergency ward, just felt wrong during those long, quiet nights. The air was different, heavier, like it was charged with something you couldn't quite see. I brushed it off as paranoia, as exhaustion after too many double shifts. I thought I was just overworked, until that night. It started like any other graveyard shift. We'd had a few patients come through, mostly minor injuries, the occasional overdose. Typical stuff for a Friday night. I was working with Dr. Ramirez, one of the more experienced physicians. She was sharp, efficient, but also had a sense of humor that helped lighten the mood on those long nights. Around 2:30 a.m., we had a lull, so we sat in the break room sipping stale coffee. "We'll probably get another wave soon," she said, glancing at her watch. "Drunks, maybe, or a bar fight, or someone deciding to do something stupid in the middle of the night," I replied, yawning. Not 10 minutes later, the call came in. A paramedic's voice crackled over the radio, bringing in a male, late 20-second, severe lacerations, unconscious. Estimated time of arrival 5 minutes. Ramirez and I looked at each other, and I could tell by the look in her eyes that she felt it too. That strange tension that settled in the air when something serious was about to go down. When the paramedics wheeled the man in, I got a good look at him. He was young, maybe 28 or 29, with blood matted in his hair and a deep gash running from his forehead to his jaw. His clothes were torn, covered in dirt and blood. Whatever had happened to him had been violent, very violent. "Car accident?" I asked the paramedic as we wheeled him into the trauma room. The paramedic shook his head, his face pale. "We found him on the side of the road, no car in sight. He was alone, no ID, no phone. Just there." I didn't have time to process that. We had to focus on stabilizing him. Dr. Ramirez barked orders as I helped with the equipment. We worked quickly, trying to stop the bleeding and assess the full extent of his injuries. The machines beeped steadily, and for a moment, it looked like we had him stable. Then the monitors went haywire. His heart rate spiked, the beeping growing louder and faster until it flatlined. Ramirez cursed under her breath and grabbed the defibrillator. I could feel the tension in the room rise as she pressed the paddles to his chest. Clear. The man's body jolted, but nothing changed. The flatline continued. "Clear," she said again, more forcefully. Another jolt. Still nothing. For a third time she shocked him, but the heart monitor didn't budge. After what felt like hours, Ramirez finally stepped back, her face drawn. She glanced at the clock and sighed. Time of death, 3:07 a.m. I stood there, staring at the man's lifeless body. There was something off about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something. Ramirez pulled off her gloves and looked at me. "Let's notify the morgue." I nodded, but as I turned to leave the trauma room, I heard it, a faint rasping sound, like someone struggling to breathe. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Ramirez looked at me, confused. "Hear what?" I turned back to the bed, expecting to see the man lying there still dead. But his chest, it was moving. "Dr. Ramirez," I said, my voice shaking. "He's breathing." She spun around, her eyes wide. The flatline was still on the monitor, but the man's chest was rising and falling, slow and shallow, like he was fighting to stay alive. "That's not possible," she muttered, rushing to check his pulse. She pressed her fingers to his neck, and her face went pale. No pulse. My stomach twisted into knots. How could he be breathing without a pulse? Before I could say anything, the man's eyes snapped open. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the equipment. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, fixed on me, unblinking. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared, and then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he turned his head to look at Ramirez. "Impossible," she whispered, stepping back. The lights in the trauma room flickered, and the air grew colder, like someone had opened a window to a freezing winter night. I shivered, my breath visible in the sudden chill. The man's mouth twitched, and then he spoke. His voice was a low rasp, barely audible, but it sent a wave of dread through me. "You shouldn't have let me die." Ramirez's eyes widened in terror. What are you?" The man's body jerked violently, like he was having a seizure. His head lolled to the side, and a guttural growl escaped his throat. The machines in the room started beeping erratically, and I could feel the room growing darker, like the shadows were closing in on us. "I didn't die alone," he rasped, his eyes now locked on me. "And neither will you." The temperature dropped again and I could barely move, frozen in place as the lights flickered wildly. Ramirez tried to rush for the door, but it slammed shut on its own, trapping us inside the trauma room with the impossible undead man on the table. He began to sit up, his limbs moving stiffly like he wasn't in control of his own body. Ramirez screamed, and I watched in horror as the man reached out toward her, his fingers twisting into grotesque shapes. She backed up against the wall, but there was nowhere to go. I don't know how, but I managed to snap out of my paralysis long enough to grab a nearby syringe filled with a sedative. I rushed forward, stabbing it into the man's arm, hoping to knock him out. It didn't work. His gaze turned back to me, his lips curling into a twisted grin. "You can't stop me. I'm already dead." The shadows in the room seemed to pulse and writhe, growing darker and more oppressive by the second. Ramirez was screaming, and I realized that I was too, but it was drowned out by the sound of the machines blaring, the lights flickering, and the cold echoing voice of the man, or whatever he was. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The light stabilized, the room grew quiet, and the man's body collapsed back onto the table, completely still. The flat line returned on the monitor, and the air warmed back to its normal temperature. Ramirez was sobbing, shaking in the corner, and I felt like I was going to pass out. I slowly approached the bed, half expecting him to lunge at me again, but when I checked his pulse this time, there was nothing. He was gone, for real. We didn't speak about what happened that night. No one would have believed us if we had. The official report said that the man died at 3:07 a.m., as if nothing unusual had happened. But I know the truth. And every time I walk past Trauma Room 3, I swear I can still hear his voice, whispering from the shadows. "You shouldn't have let me die." I had never believed in ghosts, not until I started working at Ridgeway General. As a new nurse, I was eager to prove myself, and the night shifts were the perfect opportunity. Hospitals at night were eerily quiet, but I'd never been one to buy into the ghost stories shared in the break room. After all, hospitals were full of life and death, no need to invent supernatural nonsense. That was until I was assigned to the old West Wing. The West Wing of Ridgeway had been mostly abandoned for years. Built in the 1960s, it was once the busiest part of the hospital, but as newer, more modern wings were added, the old section slowly fell into disuse. Now, only a few rooms were kept open for overflow patients when the hospital was at capacity, and even then it was rare for anyone to be placed there. I wasn't thrilled about being assigned to it. The lighting was dim, the walls were outdated, and everything felt old. But that night, the hospital was full, and the only available bed was in room 16 deep in the West Wing. My patient, Mr. Holloway, was in his late 70s and recovering from a minor heart procedure. He had been stable all day, so I expected an uneventful shift. I introduced myself and did my rounds, checking his vitals, administering his meds, and making sure he was comfortable. Mr. Holloway was a quiet man, speaking only when necessary, but I caught him glancing toward the door more than once, as if expecting someone. "Everything all right, Mr. Holloway?" I asked, noticing his unease. He nodded but kept his eyes fixed on the door. "I'm fine. It's just strange being down here. Used to be busier, you know, lots of people." I smiled, trying to lighten the mood. "I can imagine, but don't worry, we'll keep an eye on you." He nodded again, but his expression didn't change. As the night went on, the hospital settled into its usual late-night routine. The soft hum of the machines and the occasional footsteps down the hallway were the only sounds that broke the silence. I was stationed just down the hall from room 16, keeping an eye on the monitors and making notes in my patient charts when I heard it. A faint knocking. I paused, listening closely. It was coming from down the hall, from Mr. Holloway's room. I frowned, glancing at the monitor. His vitals were stable, so I assumed he might just be restless. I grabbed my clipboard and walked toward his room. As I approached the door, the knocking stopped. I stepped inside. Mr. Holloway was awake, staring at the door again, his face pale. He looked up at me as I entered. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. "Hear what?" I replied, trying to keep my tone light. He gestured toward the door. "Someone knocking. It's been going on for a while now." I glanced around the room. There was no one there but us. "There's no one here, Mr. Holloway. Maybe you're hearing things from the other side of the wing." He shook his head, looking frustrated. "No, it was right here, at the door. I checked the hallway, empty. I'll keep an eye on things," I reassured him, though something about his tone unnerved me. I didn't want to admit it, but the idea of knocking with no source was unsettling. I returned to the nurse's station, half expecting the night to carry on without further incident. But about an hour later, I heard it again. Knocking, faint but distinct, coming from the direction of room 16. I stood up, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. I checked the security camera feed that monitored the hall. No one was there. I stared at the screen for a long moment before grabbing my stethoscope and heading back toward the room. The door to Mr. Holloway's room was closed. I knocked softly before entering. When I stepped inside, the air felt wrong. There was a heaviness to it, a slight chill that hadn't been there before. Mr. Holloway was sitting up in bed, his eyes wide. "Did you see her?" he whispered. I blinked, confused. "See who?" "The woman. She was standing right there at the foot of my bed." My blood ran cold. "Mr. Holloway, there's no one else here. You've been alone the whole time." His hand trembled as he pointed. "She's been coming and going." She looks at me, like she's waiting. A pit formed in my stomach. I'd heard patients hallucinate from medication, especially in the elderly, but there was something about the way he spoke, so certain, so fearful that I couldn't shake. "I think you might be seeing things, Mr. Holloway," I said softly, trying to calm him down. "Maybe it's the medication." He cut me off. "No, I know what I saw." I checked his vitals again. They were steady, but his heart rate had increased slightly. I tried to reassure him, offering to stay a little longer, but the fear in his eyes didn't fade. Eventually, I left the room, hoping the rest of the night would be quieter, but it wasn't. Around 3:00 a.m., the knocking started again, louder this time, and it wasn't just coming from room 16. It was echoing down the entire hall. I stood up from the nurse's station, my heart racing. The sound reverberated off the walls, slow and deliberate, as though someone was walking from door to door, knocking as they went. I checked the security feed again. Nothing. The cameras showed an empty, still hallway, yet the sound persisted. I felt a creeping sense of dread crawl up my spine. This wasn't normal. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the other night nurse to come down and check it out with me. But as I looked back down the hall toward room 16, I froze. The door was wide open. I had closed it when I left. I swallowed hard and started walking toward the room. Each step felt heavier, as though something was urging me to turn around. The door creaked as I pushed it farther open, and when I stepped inside, the room was empty. Mr. Holloway was gone. The bed was neatly made, the machines disconnected, and there was no sign that anyone had ever been there. My heart pounded in my chest as I frantically searched the room, pulling back the curtains and checking the bathroom. Nothing. I rushed to the nurse's station and checked the logs. Mr. Holloway had been checked into room 16 earlier that evening, but now his record was gone, completely erased from the system. It was as though he had never been admitted in the first place. I spent the rest of the night in a daze, unable to explain what had happened. By morning, I was ready to confront the charge nurse and figure out what was going on. But when I mentioned Mr. Holloway, she gave me a strange look. "There's no Mr. Holloway here," she said, flipping through the records. "And room 16, that room's been empty for years. No one's been assigned there in ages." I didn't know what to say. The room, the knocking, the patient, they were real. I had seen them, but as I stood there, I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. Room 16 had been closed after an elderly patient died there, over a decade ago. His name was Mr. Holloway. Hospitals at night are different. The daytime brings life, chatter, and the buzz of activity. But after sundown, when the hallways are quiet and the lights dim, something changes. Shadows stretch longer and silence grows heavier. And sometimes things happen that just can't be explained. I never believed in ghosts or anything like that. But after what happened to me at St. Benedict's Hospital, I don't know what to believe anymore. I had been working as a nurse for a few years, and I thought I had seen it all. The late-night shifts didn't bother me much. I actually preferred them. Fewer people, less chaos. It was peaceful, or so I thought. It started when I was assigned to the new wing of the hospital, the one they'd recently built to accommodate more patients. It was modern, well-lit, and clean, but despite all the upgrades, there was something off about it. maybe it was because it was so empty most of the time. The hospital hadn't reached full capacity yet, and some nights I'd be the only one on duty in that entire section. I had been working the night shift for a couple of months when I first noticed her, the night nurse. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed she was a new hire, someone working the same shift as me. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, her uniform crisp and spotless. She had an air of professionalism about her, always moving silently down the halls, her face emotionless. The first time I saw her was when I was doing my rounds. It was about 2 a.m., and I'd just finished checking on the patients in the East Wing. I was walking back to the nurse's station when I saw her standing at the end of the corridor, her back to me. She seemed to be staring into one of the rooms. "Hey," I called out, trying to be friendly. "You must be new here." She didn't respond. I walked closer, but before I could reach her, she turned and disappeared around the corner. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe she didn't hear me or was just in a hurry. No big deal. But over the next few nights, I kept seeing her, always in the same uniform, always at night, and always in the farthest part of the hospital where the older patients stayed. She never spoke to anyone, never interacted with the other staff. It was like she was just there, watching. One night, I decided to introduce myself properly. It was late, around 3 a.m., and I had finished my rounds early. The hospital was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the only person alive. I walked down the hall, looking for her. I found her in the same place, standing at the end of the corridor, staring into one of the rooms. "Hey," I said again, walking up to her. "I don't think we've met yet. I'm Jenny." This time she turned to face me. Her eyes were dark, almost hollow, and her face was pale, like she hadn't seen sunlight in years. But what struck me the most was her expression, completely blank. There was no hint of recognition, no smile, nothing. "I work nights too," I continued, trying to fill the awkward silence. "It's kind of eerie around here, huh?" She didn't respond. Instead, she just stared at me, her gaze cold and unblinking. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced a smile and nodded. "Well, it was nice meeting you." I turned to walk away, but as I did, I felt her eyes on me, following me down the hallway. I didn't look back. That was when things started to get weird. The next night, I mentioned the night nurse to a couple of the other staff members during our shift change. I asked if anyone else had met her, but they all looked at me like I was crazy. "There's no other night nurse on duty," one of the older nurses said, frowning. "It's just you." I laughed, thinking they were messing with me. "Come on, I've seen her. She's always in the East Wing at night," but they just shook their heads. "Jenny, you're the only one scheduled for nights in that wing." I didn't know what to say. I had seen her. I knew I had. She wasn't a figment of my imagination. Determined to prove that I wasn't losing my mind, I decided to watch for her the next night. I set up my rounds as usual, but made sure to take my time when I got to the East Wing. It was late, past 2 a.m., and the hospital was dead silent. I walked slowly down the corridor, my heart pounding in my chest, my ears straining for any sound. And then I saw her. She was standing outside one of the rooms, her back to me as usual. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. I wanted to confront her, to ask her who she was and why no one else seemed to know about her. But something about her presence made me uneasy, like I was intruding on something I wasn't supposed to see. I stepped forward, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. "Hey," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Who are you?" She didn't move. I walked closer, my pulse racing. "I know you're not on staff. Why are you here?" Still no response. Finally, I reached out to tap her on the shoulder, but the moment my fingers brushed her uniform, she vanished. I don't mean she walked away or turned a corner. I mean she literally disappeared. One second she was there, and the next, she was gone, leaving nothing but empty space where she had been standing. I stood there, frozen in place, my hands still hovering in the air. I couldn't process what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? I didn't sleep that day. When I returned from my next shift, I was on edge, jumping at every sound, every flicker of light. But I didn't see her that night, or the next. For a while I thought maybe it was over, that whatever had happened was just some bizarre hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But then about a week later, I got called into work on my day off. The hospital was short-staffed, and they needed me to cover a night shift in the East Wing. I didn't want to go, but I didn't have a choice. The shift was uneventful at first, the usual patients, the usual routine. But around 3 a.m., I got a call from one of the older patients in room 208. Mrs. Palmer was in her 70s, recovering from hip surgery. She was a sweet woman, always polite, never caused any trouble. But that night, her voice was trembling when she spoke. "Nurse, please, can you come to my room? There's someone standing outside my door." My blood ran cold. I rushed to room 208, my heart pounding. When I got there, Mrs. Palmer was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "She's been watching me," she whispered. "She doesn't say anything, she just stands there." I looked out into the hallway, but it was empty. "There's no one there, Mrs. Palmer," I said, trying to calm her down. But she shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "She was just there. She's been watching me every night." I stayed with her for a while, holding her hand and reassuring her that everything was fine. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. After that night, more patients started reporting strange sightings. They all described the same thing: a tall woman in a nurse's uniform, standing at the end of the hallway, watching them. Some said she appeared in their rooms, standing silently by their beds. Others claimed she followed them, her footsteps echoing in the darkness. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just a series of coincidences or hallucinations. But deep down, I knew the truth. The night nurse was real, and she was still watching. No one ever found out who she was or where she came from. But one thing was certain: she only appeared at night. And once you saw her, you never forgot her. Now, whenever I work the night shift, I avoid the East Wing. I can't stand the thought of seeing her again, of feeling those cold, hollow eyes watching me from the shadows. But sometimes when the hospital is quiet and the halls are empty, I still feel her presence. I've tried to forget about the night nurse and the eerie experiences that followed, but the memories have a way of lingering, especially during the quiet hours of the night shift. I thought if I stayed away from the East Wing and kept to the other parts of the hospital, I could escape the shadow of the woman who haunted my nightmares. Yet, avoiding the East Wing proved nearly impossible. The hospital's layout made it easy to end up there by accident. The hospital corridors are interconnected, and sometimes while on routine checks or attending to emergencies, I would find myself back in the very place I had tried so hard to avoid. One particularly chilly October night, the hospital was again short-staffed. I'd been working extra shifts to help out, and exhaustion was starting to take its toll. It was around 2 a.m. when the power flickered, plunging the hospital into brief darkness before the emergency lights kicked in. The dim, red-tinted lights cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly along the walls. I was at the nurse's station going over patient charts when a call came in from the central monitoring system. One of the patient alarms in the East Wing had gone off, and the system was showing a disturbance in room 205. My heart sank. Room 205 was in the same corridor where the night nurse had been seen. I reluctantly made my way there, the uneasy feeling in my gut growing with each step. As I entered the East Wing, the quiet seemed even more oppressive. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was holding its breath. I approached room 205, where Mrs. Brooks, an elderly woman recovering from a hip replacement, was the only patient. I knocked gently on the door before entering. "Mrs. Brooks, are you all right?" The room was dark, save for the faint emergency lights casting a red glow. Mrs. Brooks was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "She's here," she whispered hoarsely. "The nurse. She's been in here watching me." I tried to calm her, checking her vitals and asking if she'd seen anyone. But Mrs. Brooks was insistent. "She's been standing by the window. I saw her reflection." I glanced around the room, but there was no one there. The window was covered with heavy blinds, and the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. I reassured Mrs. Brooks that everything was fine and made sure she was comfortable before leaving the room. As I walked back down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The emergency lights continued to cast ominous shadows, and every creak of the floorboard seemed amplified. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the oppressive atmosphere made it hard to feel at ease. Suddenly the lights flickered again, and I saw her, the night nurse. She was standing at the far end of the corridor, her face hidden in shadow, her posture rigid and unyielding. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my back. "Not again," I muttered under my breath. I turned to run, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before me. My footsteps echoed off the walls, but the distance between us remained the same. Every time I looked back, the night nurse was still there, standing silently, watching. Desperate, I darted into a nearby storage room, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. I was certain that I had seen her clearly this time. She wasn't a figment of imagination or a trick of the light. I waited in the dark, listening intently. The silence was deafening, broken only by my ragged breaths. Minutes felt like hours. Eventually, I gathered the courage to crack open the door and peek out. The hallway was empty. With trembling hands, I stepped back into the corridor. The lights had returned to normal, casting a dull, steady light. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, but I knew better than to let my guard down. I had to get through the rest of my shift, and I couldn't afford to let my fear get the best of me. The rest of the night was uneventful, and the early morning shift change couldn't come soon enough. I passed by the East Wing as little as possible, sticking to the more populated areas of the hospital. I was relieved when my shift ended and I could go home, but the experience left me shaken. I couldn't sleep that day, my mind replaying the events over and over. The night nurse had been more than just a ghost story. She was real, and she was still out there, waiting. A week later, the hospital administration made an announcement about the East Wing. They were closing it for renovations. The section was to be completely restructured, with the old rooms being demolished and new ones built in their place. They cited outdated facilities and the need for more modern amenities as reasons for the renovation. I knew the real reason. The night nurse had scared away the patients, and her presence had driven staff members to avoid the East Wing altogether. I wasn't the only one who had seen her, but I was among the few who had been brave enough or foolish enough to confront her. As the construction crews moved in and the East Wing was shut down, I hoped that whatever had been haunting those halls would finally be put to rest. But part of me wondered if the night nurse would simply move on to another part of the hospital, or if she was bound to that place, forever waiting in the shadows. Now, whenever I work the night shift, I make sure to avoid the old East Wing area. I know better than to tempt fate. The hospital has become quieter, and I find some comfort in that. But every now and then, when the night is still and the shadows stretch long, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing there watching me. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. A fleeting shadow, a cold breeze, a feeling of being watched. But when I turn to look, there's nothing there. Maybe she's still out there, or maybe it's just my imagination. But one thing is certain, some nights, the silence in the hospital feels different. It feels like something is waiting in the darkness, just beyond the edge of the light. Hospitals are supposed to be places of healing, of recovery. They're where lives are saved, where the sick are cared for. But there's a darker side to hospitals, one you never really understand until you've spent a lot of time in one. I learned that the hard way. I've worked as a nurse at Brookfield Medical Center for nearly 8 years. Most of the time, it's the usual mix of overworked shifts, difficult patients, and routine emergencies. But something happened 2 years ago that changed the way I feel about this place, something that still haunts me to this day. It started with room 34. Room 34 was just another room on the 4th floor, part of the old wing of the hospital that hadn't been renovated yet. It was a small, dull space with outdated equipment, peeling wallpaper, and a draft that seemed to seep in no matter how tightly the windows were shut. We usually tried not to use it unless every other room was full, which didn't happen often. But that year, there was a nasty flu outbreak, and the hospital was at capacity. Room 34 wasn't empty for long. The first patient to be placed in room 34 during my shift was a woman named Maria Vasquez. She was in her late 50s, admitted for pneumonia complications. She was quiet, frail, and seemed grateful for the care. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I checked on her several times throughout the night, adjusted her IV, and made sure she was comfortable. But around midnight, things started to get strange. I was making my rounds when I heard Maria talking to someone. I paused outside the door, thinking maybe a family member had come by, though visiting hours were long over. Her voice was low, soft, almost conversational. I knocked gently and entered the room. "Mrs. Vasquez? Is everything all right?" She looked up at me, startled, as if she hadn't heard me come in. Her face was pale, and there was a strange gleam in her eyes. "I'm fine," she said quickly. "Just fine." I glanced around the room. It was empty, of course. I tried not to think much of it. It wasn't unusual for patients, especially those in serious conditions, to have moments of confusion. I chalked it up to that and left her to rest. The next night, Maria was still in room 34, but something was different. When I came in to check on her, she was sitting up in bed staring at the wall. Her hands gripped the sheets tightly, and she barely acknowledged my presence. "Mrs. Vasquez, are you feeling all right?" I asked. She didn't respond right away. Then, without turning to face me, she whispered, "I think someone is here." A chill ran down my spine. "Someone?" "There's no one else here, Mrs. Vasquez." She shook her head slowly. "No, he's here. He watches me at night." I glanced around again. The room was empty, as it always was. I tried to comfort her, telling her that it was likely the medication or the illness making her feel disoriented. But she kept shaking her head, muttering under her breath, her eyes never leaving that same spot on the wall. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Maria's condition deteriorated quickly. She became more agitated, more paranoid. She refused to sleep, insisting that he would come if she closed her eyes. At one point, she even begged me to transfer her to another room, but we were still overflowing with patients, and there wasn't anywhere else to put her. I asked her who she thought was watching her, but she wouldn't give me a straight answer. All she'd say was, "He's always here. He never leaves." Maria died 2 nights later. It wasn't entirely unexpected. Her pneumonia had worsened, and her body was too weak to fight it off. But what bothered me was the way she looked when we found her. Her face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, her eyes wide open, staring at that same spot on the wall. The doctors chalked it up to a bad dream or a final moment of confusion. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something else had happened. Room 34 was empty for a few days after Maria's death. But soon enough, it was filled again, this time with an elderly man named Harold Dunn. He was recovering from hip surgery and was generally in good spirits when he arrived. But it didn't last. By the second night, Harold was complaining of nightmares. He said he kept seeing a dark figure standing in the corner of the room, just watching him. He tried to laugh it off, calling it a side effect of the painkillers, but I could see the fear in his eyes. I tried to reassure him, telling him it was probably just his imagination. But as the night wore on, Harold became more agitated. He pressed the call button several times, insisting that someone was in the room with him. Each time I checked, and each time the room was empty. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard a loud crash. I rushed to room 34, only to find Harold on the floor, his IV stand knocked over. He was shaking, his eyes wide with panic. "He was here," he gasped, clutching my arm. "I saw him. He was right there." We helped Harold back into bed and gave him something to calm down, but he didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, he demanded to be moved to a different room. He wouldn't say why, just that he couldn't stay there another night. After Harold was transferred, I couldn't stop thinking about room 34. 2 patients, both seeing the same thing, a figure in the room, watching them. I started asking some of the other nurses if they'd noticed anything strange about the room, but most of them just shrugged it off. But one night, while I was on break, one of the older nurses, Carla, pulled me aside. She had been working at Brookfield for over 20 years, and if anyone knew the hospital's history, it was her. "You're asking about room 34, aren't you?" she said in a low voice. I nodded. Carla glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening. "There's something wrong with that room. Always has been." She went on to tell me that years ago, a man named William Hayes had died in room 34. He had been a psychiatric patient, suffering from severe paranoia and delusions. According to Carla, Hayes had been convinced that someone was following him, watching him at all times. He would scream in the middle of the night, claiming to see a shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed. One night, the nurses found Hayes dead in his room, a look of absolute terror on his face. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but Carla didn't believe it. She said that ever since then, patients in room 34 had reported seeing things, figures, shadows, people who weren't there. I didn't know what to say. It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a ghost story. But the more I thought about it, the more everything made sense. Maria, Harold, even the strange feeling I got whenever I entered that room, it all fit. Hospitals are meant to be places of healing, But for me, St. Gregory's was anything but. It wasn't the sterile environment or the constant hum of machines that made it unsettling. It was the things that couldn't be explained. The whispers in the dark, the fleeting shadows, and the inexplicable sense of dread that seemed to hang in the air. It was during one of those particularly quiet nights when the hospital's usual hustle and bustle had been replaced by eerie silence that I experienced something I can't quite forget. I was a new nurse, working the night shift in the older part of the hospital, an area rarely visited and known for its outdated facilities and long-forgotten history. The hospital had a reputation for being haunted, but I had always brushed off such stories as mere superstition. My first few shifts in the old wing had been uneventful, aside from the occasional flicker of a light or strange creak of the floor. But that night, things took a turn for the bizarre. It was just past midnight when I received a call from the central monitoring system. An alarm in Ward 7 had been triggered. Ward 7 was one of those rooms often spoken of in hushed tones. It was a small, dimly lit ward with only a few beds tucked away in the farthest corner of the hospital. It had a reputation for being the most haunted part of the hospital, but I'd never believed in such nonsense. I grabbed my flashlight and headed towards Ward 7. The hallways were unusually quiet, with only the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. The emergency lights cast an eerie glow, creating long shadows that seemed to dance along the floor. As I approached Ward 7, I noticed something odd. The door to the ward was ajar, and a cold draft seemed to seep through the gap. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was dark, save for the pale light filtering in through the windows. The air was heavy, and the atmosphere felt thick with tension. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" There was no response. I stepped inside, my flashlight sweeping across the room. The beds were empty, and the monitors were silent. But then I noticed something strange. One of the beds had been disturbed, the sheets tangled and twisted as if someone had been sitting there recently. I approached the bed, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The air felt colder around me, and I could see my breath misting in the dim light. As I reached out to smooth the sheets, I heard a soft whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Help me." I froze, my heart pounding. The whisper had come from behind me. I spun around, but the room was still empty. I searched for the source of the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The whisper came again, this time clearer, almost pleading. "Help me, please." I followed the sound, which seemed to be coming from a storage closet in the corner of the room. I opened the closet door slowly, the hinges squealing as it swung inward. Inside, there were old medical supplies and dusty equipment, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. I felt a chill run down my spine. I scanned the closet, trying to find the source of the voice. That's when I noticed a small, old-fashioned photograph lying on the floor, partially hidden beneath a pile of unused bandages. I picked it up and examined it. The photograph was yellowed with age, and it showed a group of nurses standing together in front of the hospital, all of them smiling. But one of the nurses stood out. She was different. Her eyes seemed vacant, her expression distant and unnervingly blank. I shivered as I looked at her. Something about the photograph made me feel uneasy. I put it back down and turned to leave the closet when I heard the whisper again, this time right next to my ear. "Help me." I spun around, but there was no one there. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, the room was plunged into darkness before the emergency lights flickered back on. A cold breeze blew through the room, rustling the papers and creating a cacophony of whispers that seemed to fill the air. I could hear them now, multiple voices all speaking at once, blending together into a chorus of despair. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The voices grew louder, more frantic, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. I had to get out of there. I turned to leave, but the door to the ward slammed shut with a deafening bang. I rushed to the door, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I banged on the door, calling for help, but there was no response. The whispers grew louder, more desperate. I could feel a presence in the room with me, a heavy, oppressive force that seemed to close in around me. The shadows on the walls seemed to writhe and twist, taking on grotesque shapes that danced menacingly. I backed away from the door, my flashlight casting erratic beams of light that only seemed to make the shadows more pronounced. I could barely think straight, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The room fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. The door creaked open, and I rushed out into the hallway, not looking back. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed in the main part of the hospital, trying to focus on my duties and avoid any more encounters with the supernatural. When my shift ended, I was exhausted and shaken, my nerves frayed from the experience. The next day, I did some research about the hospital's history, trying to find an explanation for what I had seen. I discovered that Ward 7 had once been used for long-term patients and had a dark past. Many of the patients had died there, and there were rumors of mistreatment and neglect. The photograph I had found in the closet was of the staff from decades ago. The nurse with the vacant expression was a former staff member who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. It seemed she had been tied to the hospital in some way, her spirit restless and trapped. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened that night. Since then, I've heard other stories of strange occurrences in the hospital, but I try to avoid dwelling on them. Some nights, when the hospital is quiet and the shadows grow long, I can't help but feel a sense of unease. I've come to realize that some places hold on to their pasts, their histories seeping into the present in ways that defy explanation. St. Gregory's continues to function, and the old wing remains in use, but I avoid Ward 7 whenever I can. I don't know if the whispers will ever truly stop, or if the phantom nurse will ever find peace. But for now, I try to focus on my work and keep my fears at bay, hoping that whatever haunts that ward stays away from me. It was supposed to be an ordinary shift at St. Clara's Hospital. The night had started like any other, with routine checks and paperwork, but the old hospital was steeped in stories of its past. Tales of eerie happenings and inexplicable occurrences that often made the night shifts feel unnervingly long. I was a third-year intern, working the night shift in the main building, which was known for its occasional oddities, but generally considered safe. That was until the night I was assigned to the old, abandoned part of the hospital, a section that had been closed off for years due to safety concerns. It was a relic from a bygone era, with outdated equipment and peeling wallpaper, a stark contrast to the more modern facilities of the hospital. The reason for my presence in the old wing was a simple one. A former patient, Mr. Abernathy, had been moved to a new room after his condition worsened. The old wing's electrical systems had been unreliable, and the administration needed someone to oversee the transfer and ensure everything was properly logged. I arrived at the old wing with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The corridors were dark and silent, the only sound being the echo of my footsteps against the cold, tiled floor. The dim light from my flashlight flickered as I walked, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with each step. I found Mr. Abernathy's old room with little trouble. It was just as I remembered it from my previous visits, a small, cramped space with an old bed and faded curtains. I began the process of checking the inventory and preparing the room for its next occupant. The atmosphere was thick with dust and a faint smell of mildew hung in the air. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The sensation was disconcerting, but I tried to focus on my tasks. I finished the paperwork and began to leave the room when I heard a soft, raspy voice. "Help me." I froze, my heart pounding. The voice was faint but unmistakable. I turned around, scanning the room, but there was no one there. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The voice came again, this time more insistent. "Please, help Mem." I followed the sound, which seemed to be coming from somewhere down the hall. The air grew colder as I moved, and the flashlight's beam flickered erratically. I made my way cautiously down the dimly lit corridor, trying to trace the source of the voice. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, and the shadows played tricks on my eyes. I finally reached an old, heavy door at the end of the hallway. The door was partially open, and the faint glow of a flickering light came from within. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, save for an old, rusted bed and some dusty medical equipment. The voice had stopped, but the air felt heavy, laden with an oppressive presence. I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I saw it, a dusty old journal lying on the floor next to the bed. The cover was worn, and it had clearly been there for years. I picked it up, the pages crumbling slightly as I opened it. The journal belonged to a nurse who had worked in the hospital decades ago. As I read through it, I learned about her experiences and the patients she had cared for. Her entries detailed the struggles and the pain she had witnessed, but as I reached the final pages, the tone changed. The nurse wrote about a patient who had been abandoned in the old wing, a man who had been left to suffer alone. The nurse's writing became more frantic, describing the man's desperate pleas for help and the strange occurrences that had begun to happen around him. Her final entry mentioned that the man's cries for help had never ceased, and she had felt a deep, unsettling presence in the room. The last entry was a chilling revelation. The man's spirit is trapped here. He waits for someone to hear his cries, but no one comes. I dropped the journal in shock, the weight of the nurse's words settling heavily on my shoulders. I glanced around the room, the oppressive atmosphere now feeling almost tangible. I could sense a presence, a lingering sadness that seemed to fill the space. The flashlight flickered one last time before going out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it working again, but it was useless. Panic set in as I realized I was alone in the pitch-black room, the oppressive presence closing in around me. Suddenly, the room was filled with a cold, disembodied whisper. "Help me." The voice was unmistakable and chilling, echoing off the walls. I could feel a cold breath on the back of my neck, and the shadows seemed to close in on me. My flashlight flickered back to life for a brief moment, casting a weak beam of light across the room. In that fleeting illumination, I saw him. The figure of a man stood at the edge of the bed, his face obscured by shadows. His eyes were hollow, his expression one of eternal despair. The sight was horrifying, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. Without thinking, I bolted from the room, my heart racing. I ran down the corridor, the cold draft and the whispering voices following me. I burst through the heavy door and down the hall, not stopping until I reached the main part of the hospital. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and exhaustion. I reported the incident to my supervisor, but when the old wing was checked, no one was found. The room was empty, and the journal was missing. The staff dismissed it as a result of stress and overwork. To this day, I can't shake the memory of that night. The whispers, the figure, and the journal all seem like pieces of a puzzle that I can't quite put together. St. Clara's Hospital has since closed the old wing permanently,